Look at that high up in a cathedral, light streaming through a window that seems to hold the sky itself. Reds as deep as wine, blues like a twilight horizon, greens richer than summer leaves. It's easy to stand there, mesmerized, and forget you're looking at something made not by machines or modern science, but by human hands hundreds of years ago.
glassmaker's true masterpiece wasn't just the glass he produced. It was the furnace he built for it. This was not a simple fireplace or a blacksmith's forge. It was a sophisticated, multi-chambered structure, a kind of architectural kiln designed for a single vital purpose, to achieve and, crucially, to maintain a blisteringly high and perfectly stable temperature for hours, or even days, on end. Think of it as a proto-industrial reactor, built from brick and clay, where the difference between success and a pile of worthless, crystallized slag was a matter of a few degrees. The design was everything. A typical furnace featured a lower firebox where the master would stoke a fire of seasoned hardwood, often oak or beech for their clean, hot burn. Above this, separated by a strong arch or floor perforated with holes, sat the main working chamber, the glory hole, where the crucibles of glass sat bathing in the rising heat. But the genius often lay in the ancillary chambers. Some furnaces included a separate annealing oven, connected to the main heat source by flues. Once a piece of glass was shaped, it couldn't simply be allowed to cool in the open air. The rapid temperature change would cause it to shatter from internal stress. So it was moved into this gentler, cooling chamber, allowing it to relax and solidify over many hours, a slow, careful process that ensured its durability. This entire structure, from the thickness of its walls to the placement of its air vents, represented generations of accumulated engineering wisdom. The specific clay used for the interior lining, the angle of the flue that drew the heat upwards, even the orientation of the furnace to shield it from drafts, all of it was part of the secret. A master glassmaker knew his furnace like a sailor knows his ship. He could read the color of the flames, interpret the sound of the fire, and feel the heat radiating from the bricks to know exactly what was happening inside. He knew when to add a log of a certain size, when to close a vent a fraction, when the inferno was perfectly tamed. This was not a skill that could be written down in a book. It was an art form passed down through demonstration and practiced intuition. An apprentice might spend years merely tending the fire, learning its moods and caprices, before he was ever allowed to dip a blowpipe into the molten glass. The reputation of an entire workshop, the quality of its output, and the vibrant clarity of its colors all hinged on this one critical, fiery heart. To lose control of the furnace was to lose everything. Yet for all the engineering genius of the furnace itself, it demanded a constant, staggering sacrifice. To bring that inferno to life and keep it burning for a single batch of glass required an almost unimaginable amount of fuel. We have to step outside the smoky workshop and into the surrounding landscape to grasp the true scale. A single medieval glass house didn't just use wood, it devoured it. Historical records from England and France suggest that one furnace, operating for a matter of weeks, could easily consume the entire wood yield from several acres of mature forest. This wasn't just about burning logs to stay warm. This was about sustaining a man-made volcano, a heat so intense it could liquefy rock, day and night without pause. The preferred fuel was hardwood oak, beech, ash trees that grew for decades, even centuries, only to be fed into the flames over a startlingly short period. This created a voracious, creeping hunger. A glassworks would establish itself in a wooded area, often with a royal license granting it the right to harvest timber, and within a few years, it would have effectively eaten its way through the local fuel supply. The radius from which wood could be economically hauled was limited, and once those trees were gone, the entire operation had to pack up and move on, seeking out the next untapped woodland.
This nomadic existence became a defining feature of the early glassmaking industry. The workshops were temporary settlements, their locations dictated not by proximity to cities or trade routes, but by the silent, sprawling presence of the forest. And this relentless consumption did not go unnoticed. By the 13th and 14th centuries, as the demand for glass grew and the telltale scars on the landscape multiplied, authorities began to step in. In England, concerns over timber shortages for shipbuilding and other critical industries led to royal decrees that specifically restricted the felling of trees for glass-making furnaces. This wasn't just an early environmental regulation. It was a matter of national security and economic stability. The forest was being recognized as a finite resource, and the glassmakers, with their insatiable appetites, were often seen as a problem to be managed. But the industry's hunger extended beyond just fuel for the fire. Remember the potash, that essential flux derived from burned wood. Its production was arguably even more wasteful. To create high-quality potash, glassmakers needed the pure white ashes of specific hardwoods. This meant they weren't just burning any wood for heat. They were deliberately felling vast stands of trees, burning them in open pits specifically for their ashes, and then collecting the residue. The yield was pitifully small. It could take an entire ton of wood to produce just a few pounds of usable potash. So, for every crucible of glowing glass, there were literal acres of deforestation, first to create the potash that made the glass possible, and then to fuel the furnace that melted it. This dual demand placed an incredible strain on the ecosystem. The legacy of medieval glassmaking, therefore, is written not only in the radiant windows of cathedrals, but also in the silent, cleared lands that once stood in their shadow. It's a powerful reminder that every technological marvel comes with a cost, often hidden from the final, beautiful product. The light that filled those medieval churches was, in a very real sense, captured from the heart of the forest itself, a transmutation of ancient trees into enduring, luminous color. And with the furnace roaring and the raw materials gathered, the medieval glassmaker had one more secret ingredient up his sleeve, one that seems surprisingly modern to our ears. In the corners of every workshop, you'd find piles of broken glass-shattered vessels, flawed pieces, even the leftover trimmings from finished windows. To the uninitiated, this was just trash, but to the master, it was treasure. This was cullet, and its use was a stroke of practical genius that reveals just how sophisticated these artisans really were. Think about it. Starting from scratch with nothing but sand, potash, and lime was a long, difficult process. The raw batch was stubborn, prone to forming unmelted grains or tiny bubbles called seeds. But by adding a significant portion of this crushed, recycled glass to the new mixture, they introduced a kind of starter culture. This cullet had already undergone the chemical transformation into glass. It was pre-fused, ready to melt at a lower temperature than the raw batch. So when it was thrown into the crucible, it acted as a lubricant, helping the surrounding sand and flux melt more evenly, more quickly, and at a heat that was less punishing on the furnace and its precious fuel supply. This wasn't just a minor shortcut. It was a fundamental efficiency that made the entire operation more viable. The quality of the final glass was superior too. With the melting process smoothed by the cullet, the resulting glass was more homogeneous, with fewer imperfections and a much clearer, more stable body. This was absolutely critical for colored glass, where any cloudiness or uneven texture could muddle the brilliant hues they worked so hard to achieve. It meant the reds could be deeper, the blues more luminous, because the base glass itself was purer and more consistent. So this practice of recycling wasn't born from any modern sense of environmentalism. It was born from a relentless drive for quality and economy. A glassmaker couldn't afford to waste anything. Every shard of broken glass represented a significant investment of time, labor, and scarce resources. All that carefully sourced sand, all those back-breaking cords of firewood, all those long, watchful hours at the furnace. To throw that away would have been unthinkable. Instead, they closed the loop, creating one of history's earliest and most effective industrial recycling programs. The cullet pile was a permanent, evolving ingredient in the workshop, a physical library of past efforts that fed directly into future masterpieces. It's a powerful connection across the centuries, a reminder that the drive for sustainability and efficiency is not a new concept, but a very old and very human one, born from the simple, undeniable logic of not wasting what is hard-won. Now, with our base glass ready, we arrive at the moment of true alchemy, the point where ordinary transparency is transformed into breathtaking color. And of all the colors achieved by the medieval glassmaker, none was more dramatic, more desired, or more shrouded in secrecy than a particular shade of blue, a deep, luminous azure that seemed to capture the very essence of a twilight sky. This was cobalt-blue, and its story begins not in the workshop, but deep within the earth, in remote and often dangerous mines. The primary source for this miraculous pigment was a mineral called smaltite, a brittle metallic gray ore that, on its own, looked entirely unremarkable. But locked inside its crystalline structure was the key cobalt. The most prized deposits in the Middle Ages came from the mines of Saxony, in what is now Germany, and from distant, fabled sources in the Middle East, like the mountains of Persia. Procuring this raw material was a perilous and expensive undertaking. Miners would descend into treacherous tunnels, following narrow veins of the ore, facing cave-ins, poor air, and the constant threat of toxic fumes, for some cobalt ores are associated with arsenic. The raw smaltite that emerged was far from pure. It was a messy amalgam of cobalt, nickel, iron, and other elements. This unrefined ore was the first great secret. A glassmaker couldn't simply grind it up and toss it into his crucible. If he did, he would get a muddy, impure, and often blackened glass, a far cry from the brilliant blue he sought. The transformation from dull, gray stone to vibrant blue pigment was a complex chemical process, a recipe guarded as fiercely as any state secret. The raw ore was first carefully roasted in a controlled fire. This crucial step burned away some of the volatile impurities, particularly the sulfur and arsenic, which would have otherwise poisoned the glass melt. What remained was then crushed into a fine powder, but this powder still wasn't ready. It had to be mixed with a flux, often the same potash used for the base glass, and a large quantity of fine silica sand. This new mixture was then fused together in a special, smaller furnace, creating a crude, dark blue-colored glass. This intermediate product was called zafir by the Italians, or sapphire in Northern Europe. It was this zafir, this pre-colored, cobalt-rich glass frit, that was the glassmaker's true pigment. He would break this zafir into chunks and add it, in carefully measured amounts, to his main crucible of molten clear glass. The intense heat of the furnace would then dissolve the zafir, distributing the cobalt ions evenly throughout the batch. And in that fiery solution, the magic happened. The cobalt ions have a unique ability to absorb the warmer, yellow and orange wavelengths of light, while allowing the cooler blue wavelengths to pass straight through. The result was that iconic, deep, and incredibly stable blue that has captivated viewers for centuries. The entire process, from the mining of the ore to the creation of zephyr, was typically controlled by a separate, highly specialized guild. These color masters operated in near total secrecy, often working in isolated facilities. They sold the prepared zephyr to the glassmakers at a premium, and they never revealed its exact composition. The glassmakers themselves often didn't know where the raw cobalt came from or the precise steps to purify it. They only knew that this expensive, mysterious blue stone, when added to their melt, produced a color worth its weight in gold. This division of labor created a chain of secrecy, a deliberate obfuscation that protected the value of the knowledge at every stage. The brilliant blue of a cathedral window, therefore, represents more than just a technical achievement. It is the final product of a long, perilous, and clandestine journey, a journey that spanned continents, involved multiple secretive crafts, and turned a toxic, unassuming ore from the depths of the earth into one of the most sublime expressions of human artistry. But if cobalt presented a challenge of sourcing and purification, the creation of red and green glass using copper was a puzzle of an entirely different nature. It was a high-stakes dance with chemistry, a process so sensitive and temperamental that it must have felt closer to magic than science. The medieval glassmaker held in his hand a common material, copper, in the form of metal filings, scales, or even a prepared oxide. Yet this humble substance held a dual nature, capable of producing two wildly different colors: a deep blood red ruby or a brilliant, translucent emerald green. The outcome didn't hinge on the copper itself, but on a factor the artisans couldn't even see: the very atmosphere inside their furnace. They classified this atmosphere into two types: oxidizing and reducing. An oxidizing atmosphere is one rich in oxygen, where the fire burns clean and bright. In this environment, the copper would happily combine with oxygen, forming copper oxide, which dissolves in the glass melt and imparts a beautiful but relatively straightforward green color. This is the chemistry behind the vibrant green of ancient Roman glass and many medieval forest scenes. But to achieve that coveted, legendary ruby red, the glassmaker had to perform a much more difficult trick. He had to create a reducing atmosphere. This means he had to starve the fire of oxygen, forcing it to burn dirty and smoky. In this carbon-rich environment, the chemical reactions are reversed. Instead of forming an oxide, the copper metal is transformed into tiny, nano-sized particles of pure copper metal suspended within the glass matrix. And here lies the true miracle of medieval alchemy. When light passes through the glass and strikes these infinitesimal copper particles, they interact with the light waves in a unique way, scattering the longer red wavelengths and allowing them to shine through while absorbing the blues and greens. The result is that stunning, deep red that seems to glow with an inner fire. This process, known today as the copper-ruby effect, was achieved with no understanding of nanoparticles or light scattering. For the medieval master, it was a matter of intense observation and practiced intuition. He knew that to turn the glass red, he had to suffocate the fire. He would dampen his hardwood fuel, throw green wood or wet straw into the firebox, or partially block the air vents. He was literally choking the flame, filling the chamber with smoke and carbon monoxide, creating the precise chemical conditions needed for the copper to precipitate out as those magical red particles. The margin for error was vanishingly small. Too little reduction, and the glass would stubbornly remain green. Too much, and the glass would become clouded with a smoky, blackish tint, or the copper would form larger, unwanted crystals, ruining the piece entirely. It was a breathtakingly delicate operation, a gamble played out in the heart of a roaring inferno. Success depended on a master who could read the subtle color of the flames, the particular smell of the smoke, and the faint shimmer of the molten glass itself. He was not just a craftsman, he was a conductor of an unseen chemical orchestra, guiding a complex reaction to its perfect, luminous conclusion through a blend of hard-won knowledge and something that felt very much like art. Yet for all the brilliance of these fiery, in the crucible colors like cobalt blue and copper ruby, they presented a significant limitation for the artist. These were pot metal colors, meaning the color was uniform throughout the entire thickness of the glass. This gave the glass its profound depth and luminosity, but it was like having only a set of bold, single-color crayons. An artist couldn't use this glass to paint fine details, the facial features of a saint, the intricate patterns on a robe, or the delicate veins on a leaf. To do that, they relied on a separate paint called grisaille, a mixture of ground glass and iron oxide that produced a dark brown or black line. But grisaille was just a shadow and outline. The true revolution, the moment that unlocked a whole new palette for the glass painter, arrived quietly in the early 14th century. It was a discovery so ingenious and transformative that it would forever change the look of stained glass. And it came not from a vat of molten color, but from a small pot of a yellowish metallic paste. This was silver stain. Imagine the scene: a glass painter, perhaps in a French or German workshop around the year 1300, is experimenting. He has before him a piece of clear glass, already painted with his grisaille outlines. He takes a new compound, a mixture of silver salts, often silver nitrate or silver sulfide, ground into a clay or ochre binder with a little vinegar to make a paint-like paste. With a brush, he carefully applies this yellowish mixture to the back of the glass, in the areas where he wants not a dark line, but a splash of sunshine, a halo, a golden brocade, a sun-drenched field. The glass is then fired a second time in a special lower temperature kiln, known as a muffle kiln, which protects the painted surface from direct flame. And in the heat, something magical happens. The silver ions in the paste migrate from the surface, actually penetrating a short distance into the very structure of the glass itself. There they embed themselves, and as the glass cools, these tiny particles of metallic silver are suspended within the top layer. Just like the copper particles that created red, these nanoscale bits of silver interact with light, but this time they scatter the yellow wavelengths. When you look at the finished piece from the front, the areas that were painted with this stain are no longer clear. They glow with a warm, transparent yellow, amber, or even a deep orange gold, depending on the concentration of the stain and the base color of the glass it was applied to. The implications of this were nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, an artist could paint with light itself on a single piece of glass. Before silver stain, if you wanted a yellow robe next to a blue background, you had to cut two separate pieces of glass, one yellow pot metal and one blue pot metal, and join them with a lead line. This created a bold, mosaic-like effect, but it could feel fragmented. With silver stain, the artist could take a single sheet of blue glass, paint the yellow robe onto it with the stain, and fire it. The result was a seamless integration of color. The blue background and the yellow garment existed together in one unified piece, connected only by the painter's brushstroke, not by a strip of lead. This allowed for a new level of artistic subtlety and complexity. They could now create halos that appeared to radiate light from within, rather than being a solid, cut-out circle of yellow glass. They could paint elaborate patterns of gold thread on a saint's blue cloak, or add delicate golden highlights to hair and architectural details. The entire aesthetic of stained glass began to shift, moving away from the bold, graphic simplicity of pure leaded color and towards a more painterly, nuanced, and realistic style. A single piece of white or pale green glass could now be transformed. By applying the stain in varying densities, an artist could achieve a stunning range of hues on that one piece, from a pale, lemony yellow in the highlights to a rich, deep gold in the shadows. This was the birth of true tonal painting in glass. The technique spread like wildfire across Europe in the 14th century because it was both incredibly effective and remarkably easy to use compared to the volatile chemistry of the main furnace. It gave workshops a powerful new tool without requiring them to master an entirely new and dangerous set of furnace conditions. The radiant yellows and golds we so often associate with the later Gothic windows, the ones that make it seem as if the figures are bathed in celestial light, are very often not the product of pot metal yellow glass, but the brilliant, transformative magic of silver stain. This remarkable versatility, this ability to transform one substance into multiple effects, wasn't unique to copper. In fact, one of the most intriguing examples of medieval chemical ingenuity lies with another unassuming mineral that performed two seemingly opposite roles in the glassmaker's workshop. If you were to look at a raw chunk of this material, you'd see a sooty, blackish-brown powder, something you might easily mistake for common dirt. This was manganese dioxide, often called by its old name, glassmaker's soap. And just like soap, it had a cleansing power, but its true magic was its dual nature. Depending on how it was used, this single mineral could perform one of two vital functions. It could create a beautiful, regal purple glass, or it could perform the seemingly impossible task of making colored glass appear perfectly clear. Let's start with its role as a creator of color. When a medieval glassmaker intentionally added a significant amount of manganese dioxide to his melt, he was tapping into its power as a colorant. The intense heat of the furnace broke the mineral down, releasing manganese ions that would then dissolve into the molten glass. These manganese ions have a particular appetite for light. They absorb the green and yellow wavelengths, which allows the violet and purple hues to pass through. The result was a range of stunning purples, from a delicate, translucent lavender to a deep, rich grape shade, often referred to as amethyst glass. This color carried immense symbolic weight. In the medieval world, purple was the color of royalty, of emperors and kings, because the traditional dye used for royal robes, Tyrian purple, was extracted from sea snails in a process so laborious and expensive that only the wealthiest could afford it. To capture this same majestic hue in glass, to literally bathe a biblical king or an emperor in a light of purple, was a powerful artistic statement. It was a way of using chemistry to convey status and divinity, translating an earthly symbol of power into a heavenly, luminous one. Yet, in a fascinating paradox, this very same mineral, manganese dioxide, was even more commonly used for the exact opposite purpose, not to add color, but to take it away. This is where the name glassmaker's soap truly comes to life. The base glass mixture of sand and potash was rarely perfectly clear. Tiny, stubborn impurities, particularly iron, were almost always present. Iron gives glass a persistent, unwanted greenish or brownish tint, like looking through a very weak bottle. For many utilitarian vessels, this didn't matter much. But for the brilliant, jewel-like windows of a cathedral, this greenish cast was a problem. It would muddy the other colors, dimming the radiant blues and reds, preventing the light from shining through with its full intended purity. The glassmaker's goal was a truly neutral white glass, a perfectly clear, colorless pane that would act as a pristine canvas for his painted details and provide a brilliant contrast for his pot metal colors. To achieve this, he needed a decolorizer, and manganese dioxide was his perfect, albeit accidental, solution. He would add just a small, carefully measured amount of the black powder to the molten glass. Inside the crucible, a subtle but profound chemical swap took place. The iron impurities in the glass were in what's known as a ferrous state, which gives that greenish tint. The manganese dioxide, acting as a mild oxidizing agent, essentially donated some of its extra oxygen to these ferrous iron ions, converting them into a ferric state. And ferric iron has a very different, much fainter yellow tint that is far less noticeable to the human eye. The manganese itself, having lost its oxygen, was converted to a pale pink compound. Now, here's the alchemical sleight of hand. The pale pink color from the manganese and the faint yellow color from the cleaned-up iron are complementary. In the right proportions, they effectively cancel each other out optically, much like mixing a specific shade of pink paint with a specific shade of yellow paint can result in a neutral gray. The final result, to anyone looking at the cooled glass, was not pink or yellow, but a beautifully clear and seemingly colorless pane. The medieval glassmaker had no knowledge of oxidation states or complementary colors. He only knew, through generations of trial and error, that adding a pinch of this black soap to his melt would sweeten the glass, cleansing it of its sickly green hue, and giving him the pure, bright material he needed for his masterpieces. The true enigma for the medieval chemist, then, was not that it worked, but when it would work. They had to develop a deep, intuitive understanding of dosage. Add too little manganese, and the decolorizing effect would be incomplete, leaving a faint greenish tinge, but add just a little too much, and they would overshoot the mark. The delicate optical balance would be lost, and the manganese's own pink or purple color would begin to dominate, tinting the entire batch with a faint lilac hue. This was the fine line they walked with every batch of clear glass they sought to create. A single batch could swing from being impure green to perfectly clear to unintentionally purple, all based on the master's judgment in measuring out that one mysterious black powder. This dual identity made manganese a substance of both precision and potential surprise. It demanded that the glassmaker be part artist and part chemist, wielding a material that could either purify his canvas or paint upon it, a constant reminder that in the alchemy of the medieval workshop, the line between a flaw and a feature was often just a matter of a few grains of dust. And yet, among all these hard-won colors, one hue stood apart, not just for its beauty, but for the profound silence that eventually swallowed it whole. This was the legend of blood-red glass. A crimson so deep and saturated it seemed as though liquid rubies had been fused into the window itself. Unlike the more common copper ruby, which could range from an orangey tint to a hardy scarlet, this legendary red possessed an unparalleled depth and a uniquely cool, bluish undertone that made it unmistakable. It was a color reserved for the most sacred and dramatic moments in a stained glass narrative, the blood of Christ, the flames of Pentecost, the rich robes of martyrs. Its creation was the pinnacle of the glassmaker's art, a recipe so complex and so costly that it was likely known to only a handful of masters in a few privileged workshops. And then, as mysteriously as it appeared in the great Gothic cathedrals of the 13th and 14th centuries, the knowledge of how to make it vanished from the world, leaving behind only the breathtaking evidence of its former existence and a mystery that would tantalize chemists and historians for generations. The core of the enigma rests on a single, tantalizing ingredient: gold. While copper ruby relied on nanoparticles of metallic copper, the prevailing theory is that this extraordinary blood red was created using gold chloride. This might sound straightforward to us now, but for a medieval artisan, the process would have been a labyrinth of alchemical steps. First, they had to create the gold chloride itself, a feat requiring aqua regia, a fiercely corrosive mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids capable of dissolving the otherwise inert noble metal. The knowledge of how to distill these powerful acids was itself a closely guarded secret, typically the domain of alchemists and early chemists working on the fringes of science. Once they had this precious, corrosive liquid, they would dissolve tiny flakes of gold in it, creating a solution of gold chloride. This solution couldn't simply be poured into the molten glass. The intense heat and the chemical environment of the main furnace would destroy it. Instead, the gold chloride was likely applied in a second firing, much like silver stain. A theory suggests that artisans may have painted a solution of gold chloride onto a piece of already formed colorless glass, and then fired it in a muffle kiln. In the heat, a breathtaking transformation occurred. The gold chloride broke down, and atoms of metallic gold were reduced, forming tiny nanoparticles suspended in the surface layer of the glass. Just as with copper, the magic was in the scale. These gold nanoparticles have a unique property. They absorb green and blue light intensely and scatter red light, but they do so in a way that produces a much purer, more brilliant, and deeper red than copper ever could. That signature blood red with its subtle, cool undertones. The sheer expense and difficulty of this process meant that this glass was never common. It appears in fragments and in specific, important windows, a testament to a patron's immense wealth and a workshop's supreme skill. But this also made the knowledge incredibly fragile. It resided with a very small, elite group of craftsmen. The reasons for its disappearance are as complex as the recipe itself. The social and economic upheavals of the 14th century, particularly the Black Death that swept through Europe beginning in 1347, cannot be overstated. This pandemic decimated the population, wiping out entire villages and, crucially, killing master craftsmen who carried irreplaceable knowledge in their heads. A workshop that had perfected the blood red technique could have been entirely erased in a matter of weeks. Its apprentices dead before they could fully learn the master's most precious secrets. Furthermore, the economic collapse that followed the plague meant there were far fewer patrons able to fund such extravagant projects. The demand for the most expensive and difficult-to-produce materials simply evaporated. The knowledge no longer practiced or passed on faded from memory, becoming first a rarity, then a rumor, and finally, a ghost in the history of technology. For centuries that followed, the ruby red glass that adorned the great cathedrals stood as a silent rebuke to later generations of glassmakers. They could see the evidence of a superior technology, a color they could not replicate. They knew it involved gold, the flecks of gold visible in some fragments hinted at that, but the precise alchemical preparation and the firing technique remained a maddening puzzle. This led to a long and often fanciful period of rediscovery, filled with dead ends and accidental breakthroughs. The most famous of these rediscoveries came from a German alchemist and glassmaker named Johann Kunkel in the late 17th century. The story goes that Kunkel, while experimenting in his laboratory, accidentally spilled a solution of gold into a batch of molten glass. Believing the batch was ruined, he discarded the material into his waste heap. Later, he noticed a brilliant red shimmer among the broken fragments and realized with astonishment that he had stumbled upon the long-lost secret. While this tale is likely apocryphal, it perfectly captures the aura of chance and mystery that surrounded the color. Kunkel's method, which he detailed more systematically, essentially rediscovered the process of creating gold ruby glass, cementing his name in history. Yet, even with Kunkel's success, the medieval blood red retains its aura. The specific composition of the base glass, the exact particle size of the gold, and the particular firing conditions used by the Gothic masters created a shade that many connoisseurs believe has never been perfectly duplicated. The lost recipe is more than just a technical formula. It is a symbol of the fragile thread that connects us to the past, a reminder that even the most advanced knowledge is vulnerable, and that the brightest light can sometimes be tragically extinguished. With the elements gathered, the furnace perfected, and the alchemical secrets of color mastered, the entire enterprise would have been for nothing without a social structure powerful enough to protect it. This is where we step out of the smoky workshop and into the equally intense world of the glassmakers' guilds. These weren't just trade unions or social clubs. They were the absolute guardians of the craft's survival, formidable institutions that wielded immense economic and political power. To understand how a complex recipe could survive for centuries, you have to understand the guild system. It was a world built on a simple, unshakable principle: control everything. They controlled who could make glass, what kind of glass they could make, how much they could produce, and most critically, they controlled the flow of knowledge itself. In an age before patents and copyrights, the guild's monopoly was its lifeblood, and it defended that monopoly with a ferocity that could determine the fate of entire cities and the men who lived in them. The path to becoming a master glassmaker was not a career choice. It was a protracted and grueling rite of passage, a journey that could span more than a decade of a young man's life. It began when a boy, often as young as 12, was formally apprenticed to a master. His family would pay a substantial fee, and both parties would sign a contract that was as much a legal document as it was a vow. The apprentice didn't just learn a trade. He was absorbed into the master's household, becoming part of his extended family. His days were not spent delicately painting glass. They began at dawn, filled with the most menial and back-breaking labor. He would haul wood and sand, clean the workshop, stoke the furnace for endless hours, and mix batches of raw materials. This wasn't mere exploitation. It was a deliberate system of testing and conditioning. The master was assessing the boy's character, his patience, his diligence, his ability to follow orders without question. The young apprentice was learning the fundamental rhythm of the workshop through his muscles and his sweat, internalizing the physical demands of the craft before he was ever trusted with its intellectual secrets. After 7 long years, if he had proven himself worthy, the apprentice would undergo a formal examination to become a journeyman. This was a monumental step. He was now a skilled craftsman, paid for his labor, and he was expected to travel to journey from city to city, working in different workshops to broaden his experience. This period of travel was essential. It prevented any single master from hoarding all the latest techniques and ensured a cross-pollination of ideas across regions. A journeyman from Venice might bring news of a new furnace design to Germany. One from France might share a subtle trick for applying silver stain. But even as a journeyman, he was still bound by the guild's strict rules. He was not allowed to open his own workshop or take on apprentices. He worked for masters, and his knowledge, while deep, was still incomplete. The final, almost mythical summit was the rank of master. To achieve this, a journeyman had to create his masterpiece, a piece of work that definitively proved he possessed complete command of the craft. This wasn't just a single stained glass panel. For a glassmaker, it could be an entire suite of work demonstrating skill in making the base glass, creating multiple colors, and forming complex vessels or window elements. His masterpiece would be judged by a panel of existing masters, who scrutinized it not just for technical perfection, but for evidence of that ineffable master's touch. But the final hurdle was often not the work itself, but the politics and economics of the guild. A new master needed the approval of his peers, and they were often reluctant to welcome a new competitor who would slice the local market into smaller pieces. He had to prove he was financially solvent, able to support a workshop and a family without bringing disgrace upon the guild. Only then, after this decades-long odyssey, would he be sworn in as a full master, granted the right to open his own workshop, take on his own apprentices, and finally, access the guild's most tightly held secrets. And those secrets were protected with an almost religious fervor. Guild members swore binding oaths of secrecy, vows that were enforced with the threat of severe penalties, heavy fines, expulsion from the guild, or even exile from the city. Expulsion was an economic and social death sentence, cutting a craftsman off from his livelihood and his community. This culture of secrecy was the guild's primary defense mechanism. A written recipe for cobalt-blue or copper ruby was a potential disaster. If it fell into the wrong hands, a rival guild could replicate the color and break the monopoly. So, the most critical knowledge was never written down. It was an oral tradition, passed directly from master to apprentice in the hushed privacy of the workshop. The exact temperature for striking the red in a copper melt, the precise moment to add the cullet, the secret Chinese letter for signaling a change in the fire. These things were taught through demonstration and repetition, becoming a kind of muscle memory and ingrained intuition. This system ensured that the knowledge stayed within the guild's walls, but it also made that knowledge incredibly fragile. If a master died suddenly before passing on a key piece of information, that technique could be lost forever, vanishing as completely as the legend of the blood-red glass. The guilds, in their ruthless pursuit of control, became both the great preservers and the potential tombs of their own art. Imagine a master glassmaker, not in a permanent stone workshop, but on a dusty road. His furnace is not a fixed structure, but a temporary one of brick and clay, destined to be torn down when the work is done. His most valuable possessions are not gold or silver, but the knowledge in his head and the skilled hands of his small team. These were the itinerant glassmakers, the nomadic engineers of the medieval world, and their way of life was as crucial to the spread of stained glass as any secret recipe. While powerful guilds controlled glass production in rising cities like Venice and Nuremberg, the vast demand for windows across Europe, from remote English abbeys to burgeoning French cathedrals, could not be met by stationary workshops alone. The colossal cost and near impossibility of transporting large, finished sheets of glass over rutted tracks and through bandit-infested woods meant it was infinitely more practical to move the maker, not the masterpiece. So these specialized craftsmen became pilgrims of their trade, carrying their entire world with them, their tools, their raw materials, and most importantly, their fragile, unwritten knowledge, packed away in memory and experience. Their arrival at a building site, like Chartres or Canterbury, would have been a moment of great anticipation and mystery. To the local monks and masons, these glassmakers were figures from a distant, almost mythical world. They spoke with strange accents, followed routines that seemed arcane and secretive, and possessed the god-like power to conjure fire and light from common earth. Their first task was always to build their temporary kingdom, the furnace complex. Using local materials, they would construct their sophisticated kilns right on the cathedral grounds, often in a dedicated shed or workshop space. This alone was a spectacle of esoteric skill. They knew exactly how to mix the clay for the interior lining to withstand repeated thermal shock, how to angle the flues for the perfect draft, and how to position the structure to shield it from the capricious wind. To the uninitiated local laborers, this wasn't just construction. It was a ritual, the preparation of a sacred space for a kind of alchemy. Life within this traveling community was intensely insular and self-sufficient. The core team was typically small, often a master and his most trusted journeyman, sometimes accompanied by their families. They formed a mobile village bound by blood, oath, and shared hardship. Trust was their most vital currency. Every secret shared, every technique demonstrated, relied on the absolute certainty that it would not be betrayed to outsiders. Their recipes were their patrimony, the collective wealth of their tiny, moving guild. They couldn't risk writing anything down. A lost ledger could fall into a rival's hands. Instead, everything was memorized. The master knew the exact feel of the sand from a particular riverbank that produced the clearest glass, the specific way to bank the fire to achieve the perfect copper ruby, the subtle hand signal to a journeyman to add more color. This knowledge was a living thing, passed in whispers and demonstrated in the flickering light of the forge. This constant movement, while isolating, became the most powerful engine for the diffusion of artistic and technical ideas across the continent. A master who had learned a new design for a leaf pattern in northern France could incorporate it into a window in southern Germany a year later. A journeyman who had picked up a clever trick for applying grisaille in England might carry it to Italy. This cross-pollination created a pan-European visual language in stained glass, where you can see stylistic echoes from one end of the continent to the other, all because these craftsmen were perpetual travelers, weaving a web of shared knowledge with every road they walked. Yet this nomadic existence also amplified their aura of mystery and power. They were permanently outsiders, never fully part of the communities they temporarily served. While they worked, they were revered and a little feared. Their ability to work with elemental forces, earth, fire, and air, to create something that seemed to capture solidified light aligned them in the popular imagination with alchemists and wise men. There were likely superstitions surrounding them. Perhaps locals believed they could see the future in the swirl of molten glass, or that their furnaces were guarded by elemental spirits. When their commission was complete, when the last pane of brilliant blue or red was set into the lead and hoisted into the stone tracery, they would simply pack up. They would dismantle their furnace, scattering the bricks and clay that had housed such fierce power. They would load their tools and their remaining precious materials onto carts, and without fanfare, they would vanish down the road, leaving behind only their breathtaking work glowing high in the clerestory. For the monks and townspeople who remained, these men became figures of legend. The vibrant windows were a permanent, daily reminder of the otherworldly artisans who had come, performed their miracles, and disappeared back into the landscape, taking their secrets with them, as ephemeral and as brilliant as the light shining through their glass. But beyond the wandering artisan and the secretive city guild, there existed another, quieter guardian of the glassmaker's art, one operating within the hushed, hallowed walls of the monastery. While the furnace masters worked with fire and matter, the monastic scribes worked with ink and parchment, and their role in preserving this fragile technology was just as vital. In the scriptorium, the rhythmic scratching of quills was the sound of knowledge being saved from oblivion. Here, monks meticulously copied not only religious texts, but also scientific and technical works from antiquity, including the recipes and formulas that were the lifeblood of the practical arts. For glassmaking, this was a precarious lifeline. The complex, tactile knowledge of the workshop was being translated into the static symbols of text, a transformation that both protected and potentially ossified the living craft. The most famous of these surviving documents is the Schedula Diversarum Artium, written in the early 12th century by a German monk who called himself Theophilus Presbyter. This remarkable work, essentially a medieval how-to guide for artists, contains detailed chapters on glassmaking, from building a furnace to creating specific colors. Theophilus presents his knowledge not as a series of secret incantations, but as a pious act of sharing, a way to glorify God through the beauty of crafted objects. He writes with the authority of someone who has not just read about these processes, but who has likely done them himself or observed masters at work. His instructions are precise. He describes the exact proportions for a glass batch, the way to construct a furnace with clay and stones, and the methods for blowing and coloring glass. For historians, the Schedula is a priceless window into the workshop, a direct line to the techniques of the high medieval period. Yet, Theophilus's work is also a profound exception. His open-handed approach to sharing knowledge stands in stark contrast to the secretive, protective nature of the guilds. It represents an ideal of monastic learning, that all knowledge, if used in the service of the divine, should be shared for the benefit of all. But for every Theophilus, there were countless other scribes and alchemists who took the opposite approach. They understood that the value of a glass recipe, especially for a coveted color or a potent medicinal powder made from similar processes, was immense. To write it down plainly was to risk it being stolen by a rival monastery or a secular power. So, they developed a sophisticated system of obfuscation. Recipes were often written in a kind of code, not with complex ciphers, but with allegory and deliberately obscure language. This is where the worlds of glassmaking, alchemy, and monastic scholarship beautifully and mysteriously collide. A recipe for creating a deep red glass might not mention copper or a reducing atmosphere at all. Instead, it might instruct the reader to take the green lion and immerse him in the bath of the queen, or to wed the red king to the white queen in a chamber of fire. To the uninitiated, this is pure nonsense, but to a fellow alchemist or a learned glassmaker within the monastic tradition, the green lion could be a specific copper compound, the bath the molten glass, and the red king and white queen symbolic representations of gold and silver. This language acted as a perfect filter. It allowed genuine practitioners, who were steeped in the same symbolic and textual traditions, to understand and replicate the process, while it would baffle and mislead any casual reader or intellectual thief. The knowledge was preserved, but it was locked away in a vault of metaphor. This practice of encoding practical knowledge had a dual purpose. On one hand, it protected the economic and spiritual advantage of the monastery that possessed it. A monastic community that could produce its own stunning, stained glass for its chapel, or create rare pigments for its illuminated manuscripts, gained prestige, attracted pilgrims and patrons, and demonstrated its closeness to God through the beauty of its creations. On the other hand, this obscurity also reflected a genuine philosophical belief about the nature of the universe. For the medieval alchemist monk, the process of transforming base materials into something glorious was not merely a technical procedure. It was a spiritual allegory for the purification of the human soul. The struggle to achieve the perfect red in the furnace mirrored the soul's struggle toward salvation. Therefore, writing about it in plain, mechanical terms would have felt sacrilegious, reducing a divine mystery to a mere manual of labor. The coded language honored the sacred dimension of the craft. The survival of this knowledge, therefore, hung by the thinnest of threads, the life of a single manuscript. A fire in a library, the decay of parchment in a damp cellar, or the dissolution of a monastery during a period of political upheaval could erase centuries of accumulated technique in a single moment. The recipe for a legendary color might exist in only one copy, tucked into a larger volume of theological speculation, its true value unrecognized by anyone but the initiated few. When Henry VIII disbanded the monasteries in England in the 16th century, countless libraries were scattered and destroyed, and it is almost certain that unique technical manuscripts on glassmaking and other arts were lost forever in the chaos. The brilliant windows that survived in the great cathedrals are thus monuments to two parallel traditions: the oral, tactile knowledge of the itinerant glassmaker and the textual, coded knowledge of the monastic scribe. One was written in the memory of craftsmen, the other in the ink of scholars, but both were essential chapters in the same epic story, the relentless, fragile, and often secretive human effort to capture light itself. Now let's move from the creation of the colored glass itself to the monumental task of assembling it into a narrative masterpiece. The journey of a single stained glass window is a story of many hands and many stages, each one a specialized craft demanding its own set of guarded skills. It all begins not with glass or lead, but with paper and charcoal. The master designer, often a painter of significant renown, would first create a small-scale color sketch of the entire window, establishing the overall composition and palette. But the true blueprint, the life-sized map for the entire project, was the cartoon. This was a massive drawing, executed on a whitened wooden table or on sheets of parchment or cloth stitched together, showing every single line of the design in exact, full-scale detail. The cartoon was the architectural plan for the window, and it had to be perfect. Every fold of a robe, every curl of hair, every leaf on a tree was rendered with precision, because this drawing would guide every single cut of glass and every line of paint. But here's a secret the medieval masters understood about light and perception. A design that looks perfect on a flat, well-lit table will look completely different when transformed into translucent colored panels and lifted high into a stone arch, bathed in shifting celestial light. So the designer had to possess an almost prophetic vision, anticipating how the colors would interact at a distance, how the lead lines would become part of the drawing, and how the fierce daylight from outside would alter the intensity of every hue. The cartoon was more than a drawing. It was a premonition of light itself. Once the cartoon was finalized, the process moved from the designer's studio to the glazier's workshop. The master glazier would lay a large, clear sheet of pot metal glass, often that beautifully clarified, white glass we discussed earlier, directly over a section of the cartoon. Using a special diamond-tipped tool or a hot iron point, he would then carefully trace the outline of a specific piece from the drawing onto the surface of the glass. This was the moment of absolute commitment. One slip of the hand, one misjudged curve, and an expensive sheet of glass could be ruined. The skill here was not just in tracing a line, but in understanding the material's nature. Glass has a grain much like wood, and a master cutter knew how to score it in a way that encouraged a clean break along the intended line. He would then use a notching tool called a grozing iron to nip away at the edges, refining the shape, smoothing the curves, and ensuring each piece would fit perfectly against its neighbors. This was a painstaking jigsaw puzzle process, where every piece of the sky, every fragment of a face, and every sliver of a border had to be individually cut. The piles of colored glass on the glazier's bench were his palette, and the cutting process was how he prepared his paints. But these cut pieces of colored glass were still just flat fields of color. To bring the figures to life, to give them expression, shadow, and depth, required yet another layer of artistry, painting. And this was not painting as we normally think of it. The artist wasn't adding color, he was using paint to control light. His medium was grisaille, that mixture of ground glass and iron oxide we mentioned, and his brush was often made from the tail hairs of a squirrel or badger, chosen for their fine point. Working at a specially angled easel that allowed the daylight to shine through the glass from behind, just as it would in the final window, the painter would trace the detailed features from the cartoon onto the glass. He would paint the lines for a face, the folds of a garment, the strands of a beard, all in this dark, opaque paint, but his real genius lay in shading. By varying the density of the grisaille, applying it in thick, dark strokes for deep shadows, and thinning it out to a delicate wash for mid-tones, he could model the form, creating the illusion of rounded cheeks, flowing fabric, and three-dimensional space. He was, in effect, painting with shadows, using the dark paint to block the light in some areas and allow it to shine through more brightly in others. This created a stunning range of tones on a single piece of glass. A white robe, for example, wasn't just a flat white. It was a symphony of light and dark, with deep folds and bright highlights, all rendered by the painter's skillful hand. Of course, this painted glass was still fragile. The grisaille was just a layer of powder on the surface. To fuse it permanently to the glass, to make it as durable as the color itself, the pieces had to undergo another firing. They were placed in a muffle kiln, a special oven that shielded the painted surface from the direct flames, and heated until the ground glass in the grisaille mixture began to melt. At just the right temperature, it would fuse seamlessly with the surface of the underlying glass pane, bonding the painting to it forever. This firing was another moment of high tension. If the kiln was too hot, the colors of the pot metal glass underneath could be altered or burned. If it was too cool, the grisaille would not adhere properly and would flake off over time. The master had to know his kiln as intimately as he knew his main furnace, judging the perfect moment to begin the slow, careful cooling process that would lock the artist's vision into the very substance of the glass. With all the pieces now cut, painted, and fired, the final three-dimensional puzzle could be assembled. This was the job of the lead glazier, and it's where the iconic lead lines we associate with stained glass come into play. The glazier would lay out the full-scale cartoon on his workbench once more. Then, taking the finished pieces of glass, he would begin to fit them into H-shaped lead cames. These cames were not just functional, they were a fundamental part of the design. The lead was soft and malleable, allowing the glazier to bend it to follow the complex curves of each piece. He would place a piece of glass into one side of the H channel, then fit the neighboring piece into the other side, gently tapping the lead with a wooden fid to secure the fit. As the panel grew, a sprawling web of lead began to trace the lines of the original cartoon, holding the vibrant fragments of the story together. But the work wasn't done yet. To make the window weatherproof and structurally solid, the glazier had to solder every single joint where the lead cames met. Using a soldering iron heated in a small furnace, he would apply a mixture of tin and lead to each intersection, creating a strong metallic bond that turned the loose web of glass and lead into a single rigid panel. Finally, a special cementing compound, often made from a mixture of whiting, linseed oil, and lampblack, was forced under the edges of the lead cames. This served a dual purpose. It waterproofed the window, and the dark pigment of the cement made the lead lines appear even more pronounced and uniform, adding a final, sharp definition to the entire image. What began as a drawing on a table was now a solid, luminous object, a mosaic of light and shadow ready to take its place in the stone skeleton of the cathedral, where it would tell its story for centuries to come. And so, with all the colored glass now cut, painted, and fired, we arrive at a moment that feels almost like a sacred assembly. The individual pieces, each a small masterpiece of color and light, are laid out on the glazier's bench, a dazzling but chaotic mosaic. On its own, this collection of fragments is fragile and disconnected. It needs a skeleton, a unifying structure that can bind these shards of light into a single, coherent story. That structure is provided by one of the most humble yet essential materials in the entire process, lead. We often focus so intently on the brilliant colors of a stained glass window that we overlook the dark, slender lines that trace through the image. We might even see them as a necessary evil, a grid that interrupts the picture. But for the medieval glazier, these lead cames were the very architecture of the window, a framework as deliberate and integral to the design as the stone tracery that held the entire window in place. This was the art of the lead worker, a specialized craft that demanded a precise eye, a steady hand, and a deep understanding of how to make light and metal work in concert. The lead used for this purpose wasn't the hard, rigid metal we might imagine. It was intentionally soft and malleable, chosen for its ability to be bent and shaped by hand. The lead cames didn't arrive preformed. They were cast right there in the workshop. The lead worker would melt down ingots of the metal in a small, clean furnace, then carefully pour the molten lead into a handheld mold. This mold, often made of bronze, had a precise negative shape cut into it, the distinctive H profile that is the secret to the entire system. When the lead cooled and solidified, it was pulled from the mold as a long, continuous strip with that H-shaped cross-section. Picture the letter H lying on its side. The two vertical arms of the H form the flanges that will eventually grip the edges of the glass pieces. The horizontal crossbar in the middle is the core, or the heart, of the came, providing the structural strength that holds the entire panel together. This simple, brilliant design is what makes a stained glass window both flexible and strong. Each piece of glass is slipped into one side of the H channel, and its neighboring piece is slipped into the other side. The lead thus cups the edge of both pieces, gripping them firmly while also creating a small, intentional gap between them. This gap is not a flaw. It's a critical feature that accommodates the natural expansion and contraction of the glass with changes in temperature, preventing the immense stresses that would otherwise shatter the entire panel over time. The lead worker's craft, however, went far beyond just casting standard strips. He had a whole toolkit of different came profiles for different jobs, each one selected with purpose. For the vast, sweeping backgrounds of a sky or a robe, he would use a broad, relatively flat came that would recede visually, allowing the color of the glass to dominate. For the delicate, intricate lines of a face or a hand, where the painted grisaille details needed to be unobstructed, he would select the narrowest, most delicate cane available, one that would trace the lines with the subtlety of a pen stroke. For the strong, bold outlines that defined the main figures or separated major sections of the design, he might use a cane with a more pronounced, rounded core, a line that would assert itself as a powerful graphic element in the composition. The master glazier knew that these lead lines were not just functional, they were an active part of the drawing. They added weight, rhythm, and definition. A flowing robe rendered in red glass would be given a sense of movement, and fold not just by the painted grisaille shadows, but by the way the lead canes curved and swirled around the individual pieces of glass, emphasizing the drapery's form. The lead worker was, in his own way, a draftsman, his medium not ink but metal. The assembly process itself was a painstaking and methodical puzzle. The full-scale cartoon was laid out on a large, sturdy table, often covered with a protective layer. The lead worker would begin at one corner, often the bottom for stability, and start building the panel directly on top of the drawing. He would take a length of lead cane and, using a special knife, would miter the end at a perfect 45-degree angle. Then, selecting the first piece of glass, he would carefully press it into one side of the H channel. He would then cut the next piece of lead, miter its end to match, and fit it around the adjacent edge of the glass, creating the beginning of the network. As he added each new piece of glass, he would gently tap the soft lead flanges closed around the edges using a fid, a blunt, mushroom-shaped tool typically made of hardwood. This wasn't a violent hammering, it was a subtle persuasion, a way to snug the lead around the glass without cracking it. The sound in the workshop would have been a soft, rhythmic tapping, a quiet percussion accompanying the birth of a luminous giant. The lead was so malleable that the worker could bend it by hand to follow the most complex curves of the design, whether it was the spiral of a vine or the intricate folds of an angel's wing. This organic, hand-wrought quality is one of the key features that distinguishes genuine medieval glass from later, more mechanically produced windows. If you look closely at an ancient panel, you'll see that the lead lines have a slight human irregularity to them. They are not perfectly uniform, and this very imperfection gives the window its living, breathing character. Once the entire panel was assembled, a sprawling web of lead holding the colored glass in place, it was still a relatively fragile thing. The final act was to turn this web into a solid, monolithic object capable of withstanding wind, rain, and centuries of gravity. This was achieved through soldering. At every single point where the lead canes crossed or met at a joint, the glazier had to create a permanent bond. He would use a soldering iron, heated in a small charcoal brazier, and apply a bead of solder, an alloy of tin and lead with a lower melting point, to each intersection. The skill here was to use just enough heat and just enough solder to create a strong, clean joint without melting the surrounding lead canes, or worse, thermally shocking and cracking the precious glass. A master glazier moved with speed and confidence, his soldering iron dancing across the panel, leaving behind a tiny silvery dot at every nexus of the lead network. This process transformed the loose assemblage into a single, rigid unit, but the work was still not quite finished. The final, often overlooked step was the cementing. The glazier would mix a special compound, a kind of putty made from whiting a fine white powder made from chalk, linseed oil, and lampblack. This dark, thick paste was then forced under the flanges of the lead canes, all around every piece of glass, using a stiff brush or a small paddle. This served two vital purposes. First, it made the window weatherproof. By sealing the narrow gap between the glass and the lead, it prevented wind and water from penetrating the panel, which would cause drafts, leaks, and eventual damage to the interior of the church. Second, and just as importantly from an artistic standpoint, the lamp blackened the cement, stained the putty a deep, uniform black. When this dark cement was wiped across the entire surface of the panel, it filled the network of lead lines, making them appear bold, sharp, and consistent. It eliminated any visual distraction from the raw, silvery color of the lead and created a powerful, dark outline that made the colors of the glass appear even more vibrant and luminous by contrast. The lead skeleton was now complete, no longer just a structural framework, but an active, defining element of the image itself, a dark, graceful tracery that gave order to the light and held the story together for eternity. But for all the brilliance of the pot metal colors glowing in their leads, the figures would have remained flat and lifeless, mere silhouettes against a luminous background, without the final, defining touch of the glass painter. This artist worked not with the fiery palette of the furnace, but with the subtle tones of shadow and light. His primary medium was a mysterious, dark paste known as grisaille, a deceptively simple mixture of finely ground glass and iron oxide. To the untrained eye, it was just black paint, but in the hands of a master, it was the tool that could give a saint a soulful gaze, make velvet robes look soft and heavy, and turn a flat pane of glass into a window into a living, breathing world. The process began once the glazier had cut all the pieces of colored glass according to the full-scale cartoon. Each piece, whether destined for a face, a hand, or a fold of drapery, was just a blank colored shape. The painter would place it on a special slanted easel, often made of wood, and stained a dark color with a ledge to hold the glass securely. The key to his work was the light source. He didn't paint with the glass lying flat on a table. He worked with daylight, or later, candlelight shining through the glass from behind, exactly as it would in the finished window. This meant he was seeing his work in its true context from the very first brushstroke, judging how his dark lines would interact with the transmitted light. His brushes were exquisite tools, often crafted from the tail hairs of a squirrel or a badger, chosen for their incredible fineness and ability to hold a point. He would dip this brush into a small dish of grisaille, which had been mixed with a binder like water, wine, or vinegar to achieve the perfect, ink-like consistency. Then, with a hand as steady as a surgeon's, he would begin to trace the detailed outlines from the cartoon directly onto the glass surface. This was far more than just tracing. The painter was using the grisaille to control the flow of light with breathtaking precision. He would lay down the strong, dark lines that define the features of a face, the arch of an eyebrow, the curve of a lip, the delicate lashes around an eye. He would paint the intricate patterns on a king's robe, the veins on a leaf, the pages of a book held in a saint's hand. But his true genius was revealed in the art of shading. Grisaille wasn't just for lines. It could be applied as a wash. By thinning the paste with more medium, the painter could create a whole spectrum of tones, from a deep, opaque black to a faint, smoky gray. He would use these washes to model form, to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a flat, translucent plane. To paint a white tunic, for example, he wouldn't use white paint. Instead, he would use the grisaille to paint the shadows on the tunic. He would apply thick, dark strokes in the deep folds where the cloth gathered, then gradually lighten his touch, using thinner and thinner washes to suggest the softer creases, until he reached the highlights where he would leave the glass almost entirely bare. When this piece was placed in the window, the light would flood through the clear, unpainted areas, creating the brightest highlights, while the painted areas would block the light to varying degrees, producing the mid-tones and deep shadows. The viewer's brain would assemble these light and dark areas into the convincing image of a rounded, voluminous garment, all created from a single color of glass and one shade of paint. It was an illusion of staggering sophistication, a way of painting with the very absence of light. Yet this delicate, painstakingly applied painting was incredibly fragile. At this stage, the grisaille was just a layer of colored powder sitting on the surface of the glass. A strong gust of wind or a careless touch could smudge it into oblivion. To make it permanent, to fuse the artist's vision into the very substance of the glass itself, required another journey in the fire. The painted pieces were carefully gathered and placed upright in a special low-temperature oven known as a muffle kiln. The name is the key to its function. The kiln was designed with an inner chamber, or muffle, that surrounded the glass, protecting the painted surfaces from the direct flames and smoke of the firebox. This was essential, as direct contact with the fire would have sooted the delicate grisaille or caused thermal shock, cracking the expensive glass. The firing was a masterclass in temperature control. The kiln was slowly brought up to a very specific heat, not the searing, liquefying inferno of the main furnace, but a more gentle, precise warmth, just hot enough to make the ground glass particles in the grisaille mixture begin to soften and melt. At this critical moment, a molecular marriage took place. The melting grisaille would fuse seamlessly with the surface of the underlying glass pane, bonding the iron oxide pigment into the topmost layer of the glass itself. The painter's shadows were no longer a surface application. They became an integral, permanent part of the window, as durable as the color that surrounded them. The margin for error was razor thin. If the kiln was even slightly too cool, the grisaille would not properly adhere, and over time it would flake away, taking the depicted soul of the figure with it. If the kiln was too hot, the consequences could be catastrophic. The intense heat could cause the colors of the pot metal glass to change, a brilliant red shifting to a dull brown, or a deep blue becoming a murky green. In the worst cases, the glass itself could warp, melt, or shatter, destroying weeks of meticulous work in an instant. The master in charge of the firing had to possess an intuitive sense for the kiln's mood, reading the color of the interior and the feel of the heat to know the exact moment to begin the long, slow, careful cooling process that would lock the artistry in place for centuries. It was the final, silent, and most perilous act in the creation of a face that could look down from the heights of a cathedral, its expression forever fixed in a gaze of divine contemplation. Yet for all the meticulous skill of the painter, his work at this stage was terrifyingly fragile, a collection of dark lines and washes that were merely sitting on the surface, vulnerable to a single touch or a gust of wind. To become permanent, this artistic vision had to endure one final, harrowing trial by fire. The painted glass panels were carefully arranged in a special low-temperature oven known as a muffle kiln, a piece of equipment as crucial and secretive as the great furnace itself. Its name reveals its purpose. An inner clay chamber, or muffle, completely enclosed the glass, shielding the delicate painted surfaces from the direct flames and sooty smoke of the firebox. This separation was absolutely vital, as direct exposure to the fire would have instantly blackened the grisaille or caused such a violent thermal shock that the glass would shatter into 1,000 pieces. The entire panel the masters designed, The painter's soulful details was now entirely at the mercy of the unseen heat swirling within this sealed chamber. This firing was the ultimate alchemical ritual, a process governed by secret temperature curves and an intuitive sense of timing that separated the master from the journeyman. There was no thermometer, no digital readout. The master in charge of the firing judged the heat by its color and feel, by the way the air shimmered when he peered through a small, protected spy hole, and by years of ingrained experience that told him exactly when to add a specific type of wood to the fire. The goal was to achieve a very precise, gentle warmth far less than the inferno needed to melt raw sand, but still hot enough to perform a molecular miracle. He was trying to reach the exact point where the finely ground glass particles within the grisale mixture would begin to soften and melt, just enough to fuse with the surface of the underlying glass pane. It was a pursuit of a perfect, narrow window of temperature, a razor's edge between failure and triumph. Inside the kiln, a silent, transformative drama was unfolding. As the heat slowly permeated the muffle, the grisale began its metamorphosis. The iron oxide pigment, suspended in the melting glass flux, was being chemically bonded into the topmost layer of the glass itself. The painter's shadows and lines were no longer a mere application. They were becoming an integral, permanent part of the material, as durable as the pot metal colors. This was the moment where the artist's two-dimensional drawing was reborn into a luminous, three-dimensional reality, its details locked in place for centuries. But the tension in the workshop during this firing was palpable. Everyone knew that the slightest miscalculation could lead to disaster. If the kiln was even a little too cool, the grisale would not fuse properly. It might appear fine at first, but over years, it would begin to flake and powder away, the saint's face slowly eroding into a featureless blur, the story lost to time. The consequences of too much heat, however, were immediate and catastrophic. An overly hot kiln could cause the vibrant pot metal colors of the glass itself to shift and mutate. That brilliant, costly cobalt blue might turn into a dull, murky green as the chemical balance of the colorant was destroyed. The legendary copper ruby, achieved through such delicate control of the furnace atmosphere, could oxidize back to a common dull brown. In the worst cases, the glass itself would warp, sag, or even melt completely, the once sharp contours of a face or a hand dissolving into a distorted, liquid lump. Weeks of painstaking labor, the cutting, the painting, the assembly could be obliterated in a matter of minutes, leaving behind nothing but a heartbreaking, worthless mass. The master tending the fire held the entire project in his hands, his judgment the only thing standing between a masterpiece and a pile of slag. He had to know the precise moment to stop adding fuel, to begin the long, slow, and equally critical cooling process. Rushing this cooling would introduce internal stresses, dooming the glass to crack days or weeks later. This final ritual was the true test of a workshop's secret knowledge, a closely guarded understanding of thermal curves that ensured the artist's fragile vision emerged from the fire not only intact, but eternally solidified, ready to take its place in the great stone wall and face the judgment of the light. This collaboration between the glazier and the mason was not a simple hand-off of a finished product, but a deeply integrated partnership that began long before the first stone was ever laid. The master mason, architect of the cathedral's skeletal structure, and the master glassmaker, architect of its luminous skin, had to work in perfect secret harmony. Their challenge was a profound one of physics and faith, to design vast openings in the stone walls that could not only support the crushing weight of the building, but also hold thousands of pounds of fragile glass, all while allowing the maximum amount of divine light to flood the sacred space. The solution they devised was a masterpiece of engineering and artistry working in concert, centered around a revolutionary skeletal structure known as tracery. Imagine the immense weight of a cathedral's stone vaulting, pressing down from above. A simple, large hole punched into the wall to accommodate a giant window would be a point of catastrophic weakness. The immense downward and outward thrust would cause the wall to buckle and collapse. So, the masons didn't just make holes, they engineered stone skeletons. They developed increasingly complex patterns of slender stone bars, branching out like the veins of a leaf or the delicate framework of a snowflake, to subdivide the large window opening. This tracery did two things brilliantly. First, it transferred the loads from the massive wall above down through these slender but incredibly strong stone ribs, channeling the forces safely to the ground. Second, and just as importantly for the glassmaker, it created a series of smaller, more manageable panels. Instead of one impossibly large and fragile sheet of glass, the window was now a collection of dozens, even hundreds, of smaller, stable units, each one securely cradled within its own stone frame. The geometry of this stone skeleton was never arbitrary. It was a language shared between the two masters. The mason would create full-scale drawings of the window openings, showing the exact layout of the tracery. These drawings were the essential blueprint for the glassmaker. He would study the intricate patterns of the stonework, the sweeping curves of the lancets, the complex interlocking circles of a rose window, the delicate flamboyant designs that looked like flickering flames, and he would design his glass narrative to fit within and enhance that architecture. He couldn't simply design a picture and then ask the mason to build a frame for it. The structure dictated the story. The lead cames of the glass panels would often carefully align with the lines of the stone mullions, creating a visual harmony where the metal and the stones seemed to be part of a single, continuous drawing. A flowing robe in the glass might be designed to echo the curve of a stone arch above it. The radiating spokes of a rose window's tracery might be mirrored by the radiating lines of a saint's halo or the folds of a celestial robe. This was a true meeting of minds, a conversation in stone and light where each master respected the demands and possibilities of the other's craft. The secrets they shared were likely never written down in a formal contract. They were discussed in hushed tones on the scaffolding, sketched in the dust of the building site, and understood through a mutual respect for the immense technical and spiritual undertaking they were engaged in. The mason knew that his stonework would be the permanent, rigid bones of the window, and the glassmaker knew that his contribution would be the ephemeral, colorful soul. One provided the strength to last a millennium, the other the beauty to justify that endurance. This partnership was pushed to its absolute limits in the most ambitious of all medieval windows, the great rose windows that grace the transepts of cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris and Chartres. A rose window is a staggering feat of engineering. It is essentially a giant circular hole in a load-bearing wall, a design that creates immense outward pushing forces that threaten to tear the building apart. The mason's response was a web of tracery of mind-boggling complexity, a radiating pattern of stone spokes and concentric circles that acts like a giant stone wagon wheel, locking the entire structure together. For the glassmaker, this presented an artistic challenge of equal magnitude. He had to design a luminous narrative that would fit this radiating circular format, often telling a story that unfolds in a ring, like the cycles of the church year or the hierarchy of heaven, with Christ or the Virgin Mary at the very center. Each wedge-shaped panel, each curved piece of glass at the perimeter, had to be cut with incredible precision to fit its unique place in the stone puzzle. The lead glazier then had to assemble this colossal circular jigsaw, knowing that any miscalculation in the curvature of a lead, came, or the angle of a soldered joint could compromise the entire panel's ability to fit snugly into the stone frame designed to receive it. The successful installation of a great rose window was the ultimate testament to this secret alliance. It represented a moment where architecture and artistry became indistinguishable, where the stones seemed to blossom into colored light, a direct result of two masters and their crafts achieving a perfect, silent understanding. But of course, the ultimate purpose of all this staggering effort, the secret recipes, the nomadic journeys, the collaboration between mason and glassmaker, was not merely to create a beautiful object. It was to construct a machine for storytelling, a luminous text written in a language of color, light, and symbol that could be read by everyone, from the most learned bishop to the humblest peasant who could not decipher a single written word. In an age before widespread literacy, the cathedral itself became the book, and its stained glass windows were the most vivid and compelling pages. This was the Biblia Pauperum, the Bible of the poor, not in the sense of being simplistic, but in its profound accessibility. It translated complex theological doctrines and sprawling biblical narratives into a visual language so powerful and immediate that it could stir the soul, instruct the mind, and guide the spirit toward salvation. Consider the experience of a medieval worshiper stepping into a cathedral like Chartres. Their world outside was often one of dirt, toil, and dimness. Inside, they were suddenly immersed in a symphony of colored light, a heaven on earth. Their gaze would be drawn upward, not to a blank wall, but to a cascade of stories unfolding in jewel-like brilliance. They didn't need to read Latin to understand the story of Noah's Ark. They could see the great ship tilting on waves of blue glass, the animals peering from the windows, and the rainbow, God's promise, arching in a sweep of vibrant color. They didn't need a sermon to comprehend the Passion of Christ. They could follow the entire narrative from the Last Supper to the crucifixion to the resurrection in a sequence of panels, each moment frozen in time, each emotion etched into the painted grisaille of the figures' faces. The windows were a continuous, immersive visual sermon, a divine drama playing out in the very fabric of the building, making the sacred stories present and immediate in a way a spoken homily alone never could. This visual language was incredibly sophisticated, built upon a foundation of symbolic color that everyone understood instinctively. Red, the color of blood and fire, was the hue of sacrifice, divine love, and the Holy Spirit. It cloaked martyrs who had shed their blood for faith and signaled the fervent love of God. Blue, the most expensive and coveted color derived from cobalt, was the color of heaven, truth, and fidelity. It was almost universally used for the robe of the Virgin Mary, depicting her as the Queen of Heaven, and often for Christ, representing his celestial nature and divine truth. Green, the color of nature, symbolized life, rebirth, and the triumph of spring over winter, making it perfect for scenes of creation or the resurrection. Gold and yellow, achieved through silver stain, represented the light of God, divine glory, and enlightenment, used for halos, heavenly light, and the garments of saints. White or clear glass symbolized purity, innocence, and divine light in its most unadulterated form. This chromatic code was not arbitrary. It was a key that unlocked deeper layers of meaning. A saint depicted in a blue robe was emphasizing their heavenly wisdom. One in red, their martyrdom. A figure bathed in golden light was being marked as divinely blessed. The glassmakers and theologians worked together to weave this symbolism into every panel, ensuring that the color itself was preaching. Beyond color, specific motifs and compositions acted as a kind of visual shorthand. The placement of figures within a window was itself a theological statement. Scenes from the Old Testament were often paired directly with scenes from the New Testament in a practice known as typology. For instance, the story of Jonah being swallowed by the great fish and emerging after 3 days would be placed right next to a depiction of Christ's entombment and resurrection. The parallel was unmistakable even to an illiterate viewer. Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the beast prefigured Christ's 3 days in the tomb, a powerful visual argument for the continuity of God's plan across history. The architecture within the glass paintings also carried meaning. A saint shown standing under a rounded arch might represent the old law, while a saint under a pointed Gothic arch symbolized the new law of grace ushered in by Christ. Local stories and saintly legends were also woven into this grand narrative, grounding the universal story of salvation in the very soil where the congregation lived. A cathedral would proudly display windows dedicated to its local patron saint, telling the story of their life, their miracles, and their connection to the community. In Canterbury, the windows detailed the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, a story of direct and powerful local significance. In Chartres, the extensive windows devoted to the Virgin Mary were not just about a biblical figure. They celebrated the cathedral's own most sacred relic, the Sancta Camissa, said to be the tunic worn by Mary at the birth of Christ. These local narratives created a powerful sense of identity and belonging. The villagers weren't just learning about distant biblical lands. They were seeing their own history, their own protectors, and their own church bathed in the same divine light as Moses and the apostles. It made the global story of Christianity intimately personal. The very act of looking at these windows was meant to be a spiritual journey. The congregation wasn't just a passive audience. They were guided on a path from the literal to the symbolic, from the earthly to the heavenly. They would start with the recognizable stories, the nativity, the miracles which were often placed at eye level. Then, as their gaze traveled upward, following the vertical lines of the architecture, the imagery would become more abstract and theological. In the tall lancet windows, single, monumental figures of prophets and apostles stood, pointing the way heavenward. And finally, in the high clerestory and the great rose windows, they would encounter the most sublime mysteries: Christ in majesty, the last judgment, the heavenly Jerusalem. This vertical ascent mirrored the soul's own desired journey from the mundane concerns of the world toward the contemplation of God's eternal kingdom. The light streaming through these highest windows, often the brightest and most brilliantly colored, was a direct representation of God's grace pouring down upon the faithful. The entire architectural and artistic scheme was designed to be a single, cohesive instrument for spiritual transformation, with stained glass as its most eloquent and unforgettable voice. Now, let's shift our focus from the great cathedrals of mainland Europe to the smoky, torch-lit halls of the Viking North, where another glass mystery lies buried. Scattered across Scandinavia, from Denmark to Sweden and Norway, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of colorful glass beads in Viking Age graves, dating roughly from the late 8th to the 11th centuries. These aren't the crude, muddy trinkets you might imagine. They are often tiny, sophisticated marvels, vibrant blues, yellows, and whites, some patterned with intricate trails or eyes of contrasting color. Finding such delicate, beautifully crafted objects in the context of a culture so famous for its seafaring raids and rugged lifestyle presents a fascinating puzzle. Were the Vikings simply fierce pirates who plundered these beads from richer, more settled lands? Or were they also sophisticated artisans, capable of the delicate, fire-based art of glassmaking themselves? This question cuts to the very heart of how we understand Norse society, not just as destroyers, but as creators and participants in a vast, interconnected medieval world. The evidence for the prolific traders theory is incredibly compelling. The Viking longships were not just weapons of war. They were the cargo ships and container vessels of their day, connecting the cold fjords of Scandinavia to a staggering array of cultures. Their trade routes, famously navigated along rivers deep into Russia, reached all the way to the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, and even to the wealthy caliphates of the Middle East, in places like Baghdad. In these cosmopolitan centers, glassmaking was a long-established and advanced science. The Islamic world, in particular, was renowned for its sophisticated glass industries, producing everything from delicate vessels to intricate beads. It's entirely plausible, even likely, that a huge number of the beads found in Scandinavia were imports. Chemical analysis supports this. Using a technique called laser ablation mass spectrometry, scientists can take a tiny, almost invisible sample from a bead and determine its precise elemental makeup. Many beads, especially those of a distinctive cobalt-blue or a bright plant ash-based green, have a chemical signature that matches glass known to have been produced in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East. They are, in effect, far-traveled treasures, arriving in the north via silver-laden trade networks. A single Viking hoard might contain Arabic coins, Frankish jewelry, and these exquisite glass beads, a direct testament to their role as the middlemen of the early medieval world, bringing the luxuries of the south and east to the elite of the north. But then, we have the other side of the coin, the tantalizing clues that the Vikings weren't just passive consumers. They were active producers. At a handful of key trading centers, places like Ribe in Denmark and Hedeby in what is now northern Germany, archaeologists have made some startling discoveries. They haven't found the massive, permanent furnace complexes of a Rhineland glasshouse. Instead, they've uncovered smaller, more ephemeral evidence. Fragments of raw, unworked glass cullet, lumps of glass that were melted but never shaped, and most tellingly, the remains of clay crucibles no bigger than a thimble, often found with tiny droplets of colored glass still stuck to their inner surfaces. These are the artifacts of a beadmaker's workshop, not a full-scale glass producer. The current leading theory, based on this evidence, is one of recycling on an industrial scale. The Vikings, it seems, were the ultimate opportunists. They would acquire broken glassware and cull it through their trade networks, a shattered Islamic beaker, the neck of a broken Frankish vase, and transport this raw material back to their home ports. There, in small workshops set up near the bustling docks, artisans would remelt this foreign glass in their miniature crucibles over a small, hot lamp-working flame. Using simple tools, they would wind this molten glass around a metal rod, often coated in clay to prevent sticking, shaping it into beads and decorating it with trails of contrasting colors. In this view, the Vikings weren't making glass from its raw ingredients of sand and ash, but they were most certainly skilled glass workers, transforming the discarded wealth of other cultures into their own distinct artistic expressions. The debate over which of these activities, long-distance trade or local production, was more significant is far from settled, and it forces us to look at the beads themselves with a more critical eye. Perhaps the most compelling argument for a vibrant local industry lies in the sheer volume and specific styles of beads found. At a single major trading site like Birka in Sweden, thousands upon thousands of beads have been excavated. While many are generic types found across Europe, others have a distinctly Norse flavor. Beads with swirling, marbled patterns or specific color combinations like yellow and green appear with such frequency in Scandinavia that they seem to be a local preference, a fashion statement that might not have been as popular in the markets of the Mediterranean. Furthermore, the distribution tells a story. While imported, chemically distinct beads are often found in high-status graves, suggesting their value as exotic prestige items, the more common, simpler wound beads are found in graves of a much wider social spectrum. This implies that bead making, or at least the local reprocessing of imported glass, had become common enough that wearing glass was not restricted to the wealthiest chieftains and their families. It had trickled down, becoming part of the everyday adornment of a wider segment of Norse society, something that would be unlikely if every single bead had to be painstakingly imported from thousands of miles away. Ultimately, this archaeological puzzle resists a simple either-or answer. The most accurate picture of Viking-age glass beads is likely a complex hybrid of both trade and local craft. Imagine the bustling harbor at Hedeby. A Norse merchant unloads a chest containing broken glass from a Rhineland monastery, traded for furs further down the coast. Just a few streets away, in a smoky workshop, a skilled artisan, perhaps a woman, given that bead making is often associated with female crafts in many societies, is melting down similar shards in her small crucible. She skillfully wins the glowing, honey-like glass onto a mandrel, creating beads that will later be strung onto a necklace for a local woman. That necklace, placed in her grave centuries later, becomes a single data point for us. It contains glass whose ultimate origin may be Syrian, but whose form and style are uniquely Scandinavian. The Vikings, therefore, were not just traders or makers. They were both. They were the vital link in a chain that transported both finished luxury goods and raw materials across continents. And with their characteristic pragmatism and skill, they didn't just acquire these treasures. They took them apart, understood them, and reassembled them into something that reflected their own world, their own identity, and their own emerging sense of beauty. The humble glass bead, then, is more than just decoration. It is a tiny, luminous witness to the incredible adaptability and interconnectedness of the Viking Age. A world where a fragment of a Middle Eastern vessel could find new life as a spark of color in the long, dark winter of the north. While the Vikings were weaving their own narrative from imported glass and local ingenuity, a far more profound and systematic transfer of glassmaking knowledge was flowing into Europe from the sophisticated workshops of the Islamic world. For centuries, while much of Western Europe was grappling with the fragmentation and limited trade that followed the Roman Empire's collapse, the caliphates of the Middle East and North Africa were nurturing a golden age of science, art, and technology. Their cities, Damascus, Cairo, and especially Baghdad under the Abbasid caliphs, became luminous centers of learning and innovation, and their glassmakers were among the most advanced on the planet. They didn't just make glass, they perfected it, elevating it to a level of refinement and complexity that European artisans could only dream of for generations. This wasn't a story of isolated development, but of a steady, transformative current of ideas that would eventually reshape the very aesthetic of European sacred art. The primary conduit for this knowledge wasn't the battlefield, but the marketplace and the meeting of minds, with one of the most significant bridges being the vibrant, intellectually fertile culture of Al-Andalus Moorish Spain. The technological superiority of Islamic glassmaking was rooted in a deep understanding of chemistry and a mastery of heat that went far beyond the European forest glasshouses. Islamic chemists, like the legendary Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Jabir, were systematizing experimental knowledge, writing detailed treatises on the preparation of substances crucial for glasswork. They perfected the creation of powerful acids and purified compounds that were essential for achieving new visual effects. Their furnaces, often fueled by cleaner burning oils in addition to wood, could achieve more stable and higher temperatures, allowing for a purer, more homogeneous melt. This superior base material was the canvas upon which they painted their true masterpieces. While European glassmakers of the same period were primarily focused on producing the pot metal colors for cathedral windows, their Islamic counterparts were pioneering a suite of decorative techniques that treated the surface of the glass itself as a field for intricate artistic expression. Two of these techniques, in particular, would have a revolutionary impact when they finally traveled north: enamel painting and gilding. Enamel painting was a dazzling innovation. Unlike the grisaille used in Europe, which was a single shade of iron oxide brown used for outlining and shading, enamel was a full palette of vibrant colors. The technique involved creating paints from metallic oxides, cobalt for blue, copper for green, manganese for purple. But instead of mixing them with a ground glass flux as in grisaille, these colored powders were suspended in a liquid medium and then painted on the surface of a fully formed, cooled piece of glass. The object, now a canvas for a miniature painting, was then fired in a muffle kiln at a carefully controlled temperature. The heat would cause the enamel particles to melt and fuse to the glass surface, creating a permanent, brilliantly colored design that sat slightly raised on the object. This allowed for an incredible freedom of decoration. Islamic artisans produced breathtaking beakers, bowls, and mosque lamps adorned with intricate calligraphy, flowing arabesques, and detailed scenes of courtly life, all rendered in a jewel-like spectrum of colors that seemed to float on the surface of the glass itself. The famous Baptister de St. Louis, a Mamluk-era basin made in Syria or Egypt in the 13th or 14th century, is a stunning example of this virtuosity, covered in elaborate, enamel-painted processions of warriors and animals. It's an object that, despite its Islamic origins, ended up in the treasury of a French king, a physical testament to its desirability and the far-reaching networks of trade and influence. Gilding was the other transformative technique, and it often went hand in hand with enamel. This process involved applying real gold, either in the form of delicate gold leaf or a paint made from gold powders suspended in a binder to the surface of the glass. The gilded piece would then be fired, bonding the thin layer of precious metal to the glass. Sometimes the gold was used as a brilliant background for enamel designs, and other times it was used on its own to create shimmering patterns or inscriptions from the Quran. The effect was one of unparalleled luxury and radiance. When used on the interior of a vessel, the gold would glow with a soft, warm light when the object was held up or when a candle was placed inside it. For European observers, particularly clergy and nobility who encountered these objects through trade or as diplomatic gifts, the impact must have been staggering. Here was a material that seemed to capture and magnify light in a way that their own deeply colored pot metal glass could not. It offered a different kind of luminosity, not the deep internal glow of a cobalt-blue pane, but a surface brilliance, a direct reflection of earthly and divine wealth that was incredibly appealing. The pathways for these techniques to enter Europe were as varied as the objects themselves. The most obvious route was through the bustling trade networks of the Mediterranean. Italian merchant republics like Venice and Genoa acted as commercial intermediaries, their ships carrying not only spices and silks from the east, but also luxury glassware from Alexandria and Damascus. These objects were coveted by European elites, who saw them as the pinnacle of sophistication. But the most profound and sustained cultural exchange occurred on the Iberian Peninsula. From the early 8th century, much of Spain was under Islamic rule, a region known as Al-Andalus. Cities like Cordoba, with its legendary Great Mosque, and Granada, with the Alhambra Palace, became beacons of a multicultural society where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars and artisans lived in close proximity, often working under the patronage of the same enlightened rulers. In this environment, knowledge flowed freely. Andalusian glassmakers were producing high-quality vessels using the very same enamel and gilding techniques perfected in the heart of the Islamic world. As the Christian kingdoms of the north began the long process of the Reconquista, slowly pushing southward, they didn't just conquer territory, they absorbed technology and taste. Workshops that had once produced glass for the Caliph of Cordoba now found themselves working for a Christian king. The artisans themselves, often remaining in place, brought their skills with them, creating a direct and unbroken transmission of technique from one culture to another. This cross-pollination did not result in mere imitation. Instead, European artisans, particularly in the rising glassmaking powerhouse of Venice, began to adapt these Islamic techniques to their own aesthetic and religious needs. The Venetians, who had already established a formidable glass industry on the island of Murano, were master synthesizers. They saw the potential in enamel painting and gilding, but they applied it to forms and functions that suited a European market. They began producing elaborate goblets, decorative plates, and hanging lamps for churches, adorning them not with Arabic calligraphy, but with heraldic coats of arms, scenes from classical mythology, and, most significantly, Christian iconography. A Venetian glass goblet from the 15th century might feature an enamel-painted portrait of a saint, rendered with the same technical precision as an Islamic floral motif, but serving a completely different cultural purpose. This adoption was a slow process, taking centuries to move from the luxury object to the ecclesiastical window, but the seeds had been firmly planted. The desire for surface decoration, for a more painterly approach to glass, which was first fully realized in the Islamic world with enamel and gold, would eventually influence the evolution of stained glass itself, paving the way for the more pictorial and less abstract windows of the later Gothic and Renaissance periods. So the next time you admire the intricate details on a medieval reliquary or the brilliant surface of a historic vase, remember that its artistic DNA may well trace back not to a northern European forest, but to the brilliant, sun-drenched workshops of Damascus, Cairo, or Cordoba, where masters of fire and light first learned to write with color and gold upon the surface of glass. While the artisans of Northern Europe were perfecting their colors in nomadic forest glasshouses, a different kind of revolution was brewing in the lagoons of the Adriatic. Venice, the Serene Republic, was ascending as a commercial titan, a nexus of trade routes that connected the wealth of the East with the markets of the West. And it was here that glassmaking was transformed from a craft into an industry, and from an industry into a state secret so valuable, it was deemed necessary to physically isolate its creators. The story of Venetian glass is not just one of technical innovation. It is a tale of political genius, economic protectionism, and a clandestine operation on an island that became a floating fortress of artistry. The turning point arrived in the late 13th century, born not from ambition, but from fear. The early glass furnaces of Venice were scattered throughout the city, their immense wood brick structures posing a constant and terrifying threat. Venice was a city built on water, but its buildings were a dense tapestry of wood, plaster, and thatch, all incredibly vulnerable to a stray spark from a furnace. A single accident could, and did lead to infernos that could consume entire neighborhoods, wiping out the wealth of merchants and the homes of citizens in a matter of hours. The risk was unacceptable to the city's ruling council, the Doge, but the fear of fire, as potent as it was only half of the equation. The other, more calculated fear was the fear of losing a monopoly. Venetian glassmakers had begun to develop techniques that set their work apart. By sourcing exceptionally pure silica from river pebbles in the Ticino River and using the ash of salt-rich marsh plants, they were able to produce a glass of unparalleled clarity and brilliance, a material they called cristallo because it rivaled the sparkle of natural rock crystal. This knowledge and the methods for producing it were becoming the Republic's most prized, intangible asset. The government realized that the true danger wasn't just a master glassmaker's furnace burning down a street. It was the master glassmaker himself, tempted by offers from rival cities like Milan or the Ottoman Empire, packing up his knowledge and walking away, taking the source of Venetian wealth with him. The solution, decreed in the year 1291, was as radical as it was effective: the forced relocation of the entire glassmaking industry to the island of Murano, a short boat ride across the lagoon. On the surface, this was a pragmatic urban planning decision, a public safety measure to protect the wooden city from its own most dangerous and essential industry. But beneath that justifiable surface lay a masterstroke of economic control. Murano was not just a new industrial park. It was a gilded cage. By concentrating all glassmaking on this one island, the Venetian state could achieve an unprecedented level of oversight and security. The glassmakers, now isolated from the temptations and spies of the mainland, were transformed into a privileged yet tightly controlled class. They enjoyed significant social status. They were exempt from certain taxes, and their daughters were permitted to marry into the highest ranks of the Venetian nobility, an honor unthinkable for most other artisans. But these privileges came with a heavy, unforgiving set of chains. The laws governing the glassmakers were draconian. A master who attempted to leave the Republic and practice his craft elsewhere was not merely fined, he was pursued. The state would issue orders for his return, and if he refused, his family could be imprisoned. In the most extreme cases, assassins were allegedly dispatched to eliminate the traitor and remove the threat to the state's monopoly. The message was chillingly clear: your knowledge belongs to Venice, and your life is bound to its service. This isolation on Murano had an unintended yet profound consequence. It created a pressure cooker of innovation. With all the most brilliant minds in the craft living and working in such close proximity, ideas cross-pollinated at an astonishing rate. Secrets that would have been hoarded for generations in a scattered, guild-riven continent were now shared within a closed, intense community. A breakthrough in one workshop could quickly inspire and refinement in another, all under the watchful eye of the state. This collaborative yet fiercely competitive environment led to a breathtaking explosion of technical artistry. The most famous of these innovations was the perfection of cristallo. This was not a colored glass, but the pursuit of absolute, water-like transparency. The Venetian masters achieved this by using manganese as a decolorizer with unparalleled precision, and by developing a furnace that could maintain a perfectly constant, high temperature, allowing all the tiny seeds and bubbles to rise out of the melt. The result was a glass so pure, so thin, and so brilliant that it was unlike anything else in the world. But they didn't stop there. They revived and perfected the ancient Roman technique of millefiori, or 1,000 flowers, creating intricate patterns by fusing bundles of colored glass rods and then slicing them into cross-sections that revealed stunning floral designs. They developed latticino, weaving threads of milky white glass into the clear cristallo body to create a delicate, lace-like effect. Their virtuosity with the blowpipe became legendary, allowing them to create forms of such incredible thinness and complexity that they seemed to defy the very nature of the material. A Murano master could coax a goblet, a sailing ship, or a menagerie of animals from a single gather of molten glass on the end of his pipe. This was no longer just functional container making. It was sculptural art, a demonstration of sheer technical bravura that was possible only because of the unique, insular, and state-sponsored hothouse that Murano had become. The island had been designed to keep secrets in, but in doing so, it became the crucible where the future of European glassmaking was forged. While the master glassmakers of Venice were perfecting their crystal-clear cristallo in a state-sponsored island fortress, a very different kind of glass was being born in the heart of the northern European wilderness. This was not a glass of palaces or cathedrals, but a glass of the people, a material so intrinsically linked to its environment that it was named for it, Waldglas or forest glass. If Venetian glass was a deliberate act of purification, forest glass was an embrace of nature's given ingredients, resulting in a humble, durable, and unmistakably green-tinged material that served the everyday needs of a continent. Its story is not one of alchemical secrets and royal decrees, but of practical necessity, abundant resources, and a craft perfectly adapted to the landscape that sustained it. The defining characteristic of Waldglas is its color, a range of translucent greens, from the pale hue of a young beech leaf to the deep bottle green of a forest pond. This wasn't a color achieved through the careful addition of metal oxides. It was an unavoidable signature, the direct result of the very earth from which it was made. The primary ingredient, silica sand, was dug from local deposits, and across northern Europe, these sands were naturally contaminated with iron. It was this iron, oxidizing within the molten glass, that imparted the persistent greenish tint. For the northern glassmaker, removing this iron impurity to create clear glass would have required a decolorizer like manganese dioxide, an extra step and an extra expense that served no purpose for the utilitarian objects they were producing. Instead of fighting their materials, they accepted this green hue as the inherent nature of their product. In doing so, they turned a chemical flaw into a beloved aesthetic, a color that spoke of the woodlands and fields from which their craft emerged. The production of Waldglas was an enterprise fundamentally shaped by its most voracious need, fuel. The term forest glass doesn't just refer to the color, it describes the very lifeblood of the industry. As we discussed earlier, a glass furnace was an insatiable consumer of wood, and the northern glassmakers established their temporary workshops directly within untapped tracts of forest. They would build their characteristic cone furnaces from local stone and clay, often partially dug into a hillside for insulation and wind protection. These structures, with their distinctive conical roofs that helped draw the fire, would rise like strange, smoking mushrooms in woodland clearings. The entire operation was nomadic. A workshop would settle in a wooded area, secure a license from the local lord to harvest timber, and then proceed to consume the surrounding forest for both its potash and its furnace fuel. Once the immediately available wood was exhausted, a process that might take only a few years, the entire operation would pack up and move on to the next untouched woodland, leaving behind a cleared landscape and the scattered ruins of their furnaces. This nomadic cycle created a migratory map of glass production across the forests of Germany, France, Bohemia, and England. The archaeological remains of these sites are often the only record of their existence, marked by fragments of the characteristic green glass, lumps of vitrified furnace lining, and piles of ash. The objects produced in these forest workshops were the workhorses of medieval life. While the stained glass artists were creating luminous saints for cathedral windows, the Waldglas makers were producing the containers for everyday existence. Their output consisted mainly of utilitarian vessels, sturdy drinking beakers, known as krotztrunk, with their distinctively prunted decoration blobs of glass applied to the surface to provide a better grip, simple bowls, wine bottles, and apothecary jars. These were not delicate, transparent objects. They were thick-walled, robust, and practical, designed to withstand the knocks and bumps of daily use in a tavern, a kitchen, or a merchant's shop. The green color, far from being a drawback, was even considered beneficial for storing certain foods and medicines, as it helped to protect the contents from light degradation. This was a democratic glass, accessible to a much wider segment of society than the luxury goods of Venice. A prosperous farmer or a town merchant could afford a Waldglas beaker, and its presence in a household was a mark of solid, middle-class comfort. The forms of these vessels were straightforward and functional, often echoing the shapes of wooden or pottery vessels that had come before them. The beauty of Waldglas lies in its honest materiality. You can see the bubbles and streaks within the glass, the slight asymmetries from freehand blowing, and the vibrant, natural green that tells you exactly where it came from. It is a craft that proudly displays its process and its origins, with no attempt to disguise the hand of the maker or the character of its raw materials. The contrast between the secretive, centralized world of Venetian glass and the dispersed, practical world of Waldglas could not be more striking. In Venice, the state went to extreme lengths to concentrate knowledge and prevent its spread, creating an artificial island of expertise. In the northern forests, the knowledge was inherently decentralized and mobile, carried from one woodland to the next by itinerant glassmaking families. Their secrets were not state secrets. They were family secrets, passed from father to son. But the fundamental recipe was dictated by the landscape itself. The Venetian master sought to transcend his materials, to create a pure, colorless crystal that was a testament to human artifice. The Waldglas master worked in harmony with his, creating a glass that was an honest expression of the local sand, the local trees, and the local fire. One was a luxury product for the elite, a symbol of status and global trade. The other was a common commodity for the masses, a symbol of regional industry and practical need. Yet, both were pinnacles of their respective traditions, representing two completely different, yet equally valid, answers to the same fundamental human desire, to transform the mundane stuff of the earth into something useful, beautiful, and enduring. The legacy of Waldglas is therefore not found in the treasuries of kings, but in the soil of forgotten forests and the display cases of local history museums. It is the quiet, green-toned backbone of medieval glass, a testament to the thousands of unknown artisans who, fueled by the trees around them, turned northern sand into the simple, sturdy vessels of everyday life. But the brilliant legacy of these medieval windows is not a static one. The colors we see today are not always the colors the original worshippers saw. Time itself has become a collaborator, and in some cases, a subtle saboteur, working for centuries to alter the very chemistry the master glassmakers so carefully engineered. This is the story of the Great Fading, a slow, silent transformation where environmental forces and the inherent instability of some ancient recipes have conspired to change the face of these luminous masterpieces. To stand before a medieval window is to witness a dialogue between the artisan's intent and the relentless passage of time, a process that has left some panes as vibrant as the day they were made, while others have faded, darkened, or even developed a mysterious, flaking sickness. One of the most dramatic and visible forms of deterioration is a condition often called glass disease, or by its more scientific name, crizzling. This isn't damage from a physical blow or the wear of weathering. It's an internal chemical crisis, a sickness born from an imbalance in the original recipe. To understand it, we have to go back to the three core ingredients of glass: silica, the former of the network, a flux-like potash which lowers the melting point, and lime, the stabilizer that makes the glass durable and resistant to water. The problem arose when the balance between the flux and the stabilizer was wrong. If a batch contained too much of the alkaline potash and not enough lime, the resulting glass was chemically unstable. It was what scientists call hydrolytically unstable, meaning it has a deep, inherent vulnerability to moisture. For centuries, this weakness might lay dormant. The glass looks fine, its color is perfect, but all the while, humidity in the air is slowly attacking it. Water molecules, ever so gradually, penetrate the surface of the glass and begin to leach out the alkaline components. This starts a destructive chain reaction. As the alkalis are extracted, they leave behind a microscopic, porous, silica-rich gel on the surface. This gel, as it expands and contracts with changes in humidity, creates immense internal stresses. You begin to see a fine network of tiny cracks, like a spiderweb etched across the surface. The glass loses its transparency, becoming cloudy and iridescent. In advanced stages, the surface actually starts to flake away in tiny flakes, and a sticky, syrupy fluid can even form on the surface, the leached-out alkalis absorbing moisture from the air. This is a death sentence for the glass. The pane becomes structurally weak, and its painted details are the first to be lost as the flaking surface carries the griselle away with it. The very thing that made the glass possible, the potash flux, becomes, over centuries, the agent of its own destruction, a tragic flaw written into its chemical soul from the very beginning. While glass disease is a dramatic internal collapse, another form of change is a much slower, more photochemical transformation, and it involves one of the glassmaker's most versatile tools, manganese. You'll recall that this glassmaker's soap was used both to create a beautiful purple color and, in smaller doses, to decolorize glass, neutralizing the green tint of iron impurities to create a clear white glass. But the medieval artisans who used it for this clarifying purpose could never have foreseen its long-term Achilles heel, sunlight. When manganese is used as a decolorizer, it exists in the glass in a higher, more reactive oxidation state, which gives it that pale pinkish hue that neatly cancels out the green from the iron. This state, however, is not permanent when exposed to a powerful and relentless energy source, ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Over centuries, the photons in sunlight provide just enough energy to knock electrons off the manganese ions, reducing them to a much lower and nearly colorless oxidation state. The effect is startling. A pane of glass that left the medieval workshop as a perfectly clear, neutral white glass can, over 500 years of facing south, slowly lose its compensating pink tint. As the manganese fades, it stops canceling out the iron. The result is that the original underlying greenish or brownish tinge of the iron impurities, which had been hidden for centuries, is suddenly revealed. The clear window slowly, inexorably, turns into a bottle glass green. This isn't a stain or a surface change. It's a fundamental alteration of the color centers within the glass itself. In some windows, you can see a clear dividing line, a sharp border between the original clear glass that was protected by a stone mullion or a lead, came for centuries, and the adjacent area that was fully exposed to the sun, which has now turned a distinct green. It's a visible timeline of sunlight's patient, transformative power. This photochemical reaction takes an even more dramatic turn when manganese was used intentionally to make purple glass. A beautiful amethyst-colored pane, rich with manganese as a colorant, can suffer a similar fate. The sustained bombardment by UV radiation can cause the color-giving manganese ions to change their oxidation state, causing the deep, regal purple to fade first to a pale lilac, then to a washed-out brown, and in some extreme cases, to become almost entirely clear. This creates a fascinating puzzle for conservators and historians. A window depicting a king in purple robes might now show him in drab brown or even translucent garments, completely altering the intended symbolic message and visual hierarchy of the composition. The artist's use of color to denote royalty and divinity is literally bleached away by centuries of light, the very element the window was designed to glorify. This creates a profound irony. The sunlight that brings the stained glass window to life, that animates its stories and floods the cathedral with divine luminosity, is also the same force that, over the long arc of history, methodically dismantles the chemical artistry that made it possible. The window becomes a living document of its own existence, its current state a palimpsest written over the original, recording the cumulative dose of light it has received since the day it was first set in place. This slow fading is a reminder that these artworks were never intended to be frozen in a museum case. They are organic components of a building, changing and reacting to their environment in a silent, centuries-long performance. So we've traveled a long road together from the silent forests where glassmakers gathered their sand and potash, to the roaring hearts of their furnaces where raw earth was reborn into something luminous. We've witnessed the alchemical magic that transformed common minerals into celestial colors, the deep devotional blue from cobalt, the fiery ruby red coaxed from copper in a breathless dance of chemistry, and the sunny gold of silver stain that allowed artists to paint with light itself. We've walked with the nomadic artisans who carried their secrets from one woodland to the next, and we've glimpsed the formidable power of the guilds that protected this knowledge with oaths and ironclad rules. We've seen how this craft was never isolated, but was woven into a vast, international tapestry shaped by trade with the Vikings, transformed by techniques from the Islamic world, and perfected in the island fortress of Murano. This was never just a matter of following a recipe. The secret of medieval glassmaking was a living, breathing ecosystem of human ingenuity. It was chemistry discovered through trial, error, and observation. It was artistry that sought not merely to decorate, but to tell the greatest stories ever told in a language of light and color that even the illiterate could understand. It was an economic engine driven by guild monopolies and the voracious appetite of the furnace. And it was a spiritual endeavor, a conscious act of devotion to create a heaven on earth, to make tangible the light of the divine. Every pane of glass, therefore, is a frozen moment in this grand, collaborative human project. It contains within it the memory of the forest that fueled its birth, the hands of the master who knew the fire's mood, the mind of the painter who gave a saint a soulful gaze, and the distant, shimmering influence of cultures far across the sea. The next time you find yourself in an ancient cathedral or a museum, standing before one of these windows, don't just look at the picture. Move closer. Let your eye follow the gentle, human irregularity of the lead lines, evidence of the glazier's hand and not a machine's. Look for the tiny, trapped bubbles in the glass, flecks of the very air the medieval artisan breathed, sealed forever in their masterpiece. Notice the subtle variations in color, the way a blue might shift from pane to pane, a testament to the unique character of each melt. See if you can spot the areas where the glass itself has changed over time, where clear glass has slowly revealed its hidden green heart, or where a once vibrant purple has faded to a ghost of its former self, a silent record of centuries of sunlight. In those details, the true story comes alive. You are not just looking at an old image. You are witnessing the culmination of 1,000 secrets, a fragile yet enduring bridge to a world of fire, faith, and human genius. These windows were made to illuminate the dark, to guide the spirit, and to tell stories that would last for ages. And against all odds, through war, reformation, and the slow erosion of time, they have. Their light still shines, and their secrets, though many were lost, still have the power to captivate us, to connect us to the profound and beautiful mystery of our shared